All right, guys, the next sentence that we're going to do is simple sentence number 3. This is probably the one that you are the most familiar with and the most comfortable with. And that is the one that you can find on page 315. It's talking about transitive verbs and direct objects. So the simple pattern is subject, verb, direct object. Okay, so as it says on page 315, and this is some things to remember with simple sentence pattern number 3, is a transitive verb is a verb that takes a direct object. And that direct object is a noun or a pronoun, or as the book phrases it, a word or word group that either directly receives the action of the verb or is naming the receiver of the action. So the example they gave in the book was the hungry cat clawed the bag of dry food. The simple direct object is always a noun or a pronoun, so bag is our direct object, and so if you strip away all the modifiers, the and of dry food, that tells us what it is. A transitive verb usually will appear in an active voice with the subject doing the action and the direct object receiving that action. So active voices, they can be transformed into passive with the subject receiving the action, but what I want from you is I want an active voice, okay? So another way to look at it would be to first find the subject of the verb and then ask yourself the subject verb what? Putting the subject and verb into the question. So for example, with James ate the cake, you would ask James ate what? The cake. David repaired his car. His car is the direct object of the verb repaired because that's what he repaired. When we say, what did he repair? We would say the car. He invited Mary to the party. Whom did he invite? Mary, of course. Michael threw the ball. The ball is the direct object of the verb threw. So what did Michael throw? The ball. Okay, now it's your turn. Let's pick I chopped the wood. What did I chop? That's right. I chopped the wood. Ooh, it's a really light colored W there. Okay, so let's pick another one. That horror movie terrified my sister. That horror movie terrified whom? Yes, my sister. Oh, you got it. All right, let's do one more. The dentist fixed Max's broken tooth. The dentist fixed what? What did he fix? Max's broken tooth, you're right. Tooth being like the main or the simple direct object. You're absolutely right. Okay, so some things to keep in mind though, is sometimes you're fooled by intransitive verbs that are in a sentence, but they don't take the direct object. They aren't capable of doing so. So we still have Christopher Columbus sailed. And let's actually change these verbs here to blue verbs, just so that it's easier for anybody with color blindness to read these. So Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic. When we ask the question, Christopher Columbus sailed what? What do you think the answer is? You might say his ship, or his crew, or maybe even himself. But regardless, none of these are in that sentence. If we'd said he sailed his ship across the Atlantic, then we could say so. But we don't know. None of these are in this sentence here. It's just across the Atlantic. So sometimes what looks like a direct object, because the across the Atlantic is a word group, and the Atlantic is definitely a noun, but sometimes what looks like a direct object is actually what's known as an adverbial noun. And what that is it looks like a noun, but what it tells us, instead of being like a subject or a direct object or an indirect object, it tells us where, how, or when. And so if it tells you one of those things, if the answer to what is a where, a how, or a when, it's an adverbial noun. So Christopher Columbus sailed the Atlantic. Sometimes we don't put in that little across the Atlantic. So we ask, what did he sail? Well, he certainly didn't sail the Atlantic. You cannot dive into the Atlantic Ocean and sail it. He sailed himself or his crew or his ship or something else. Across the Atlantic is where he sailed it. We just left out that detail. The Atlantic is where he sailed, okay? We hiked 5 miles along the mountain ridge. We hiked what? Or what did we hike? What was receiving the action? What was being hiked? That's right, we were. So we hiked ourselves for 5 miles. Really awkward sounding. That's why we don't use this, why we imply ourselves. But this then makes hiked definitely a intransitive verb. So we hiked ourselves for 5 miles. 5 miles tells us how long we hiked. And along the mountain ridge tells us where we hiked, not what we hiked. So again, this is another adverbial noun. We actually have 2 in this sentence. Now, sometimes the same verb can either be transitive or intransitive depending on how it's being used. So Jerome ran the counterfeiting machine. What did Jerome run or operate? The machine. Jerome ran around the track. Jerome ran what? Or what did he run? Himself. Around the track tells us where he ran. Now, we might phrase this sentence right here as Jerome ran the track. But again, Jerome ran what? What is receiving the action of the running? It certainly isn't the track. The track is not running, okay? His feet or his body is. So again, he's running himself around the track. One of the things that you can keep in mind is a prepositional phrase will often be used before the adverbial noun, and you can find a complete list of them in a writer's reference on page 310. My teacher always told me that a preposition is something that a worm can do to an apple. Last semester, one student suggested that it's what a bunny could do to a log. I prefer an apple just because it's easier for a worm to be among an apple or around an apple or regarding the apple, or it could be a worm plus the apple or underneath the apple or inside the apple or outside the apple. Anyway, so often you will see when you have an adverbial noun, they will use a prepositional phrase. So around or along or across. Ooh, that was a bad one. So let's go back to my galaxy one because I think that one's fun. Ooh, but not that color because that's kind of light. There we go. So across. So that's one of the things that we can test out here. So if the answer to what is myself or ourselves or himself, herself, themselves, or something along those lines, or if it's just not in the sentence, like we went to the movies. We went what? No, that doesn't work. We went whom? See, went is definitely an intransitive verb because there's no way for me to even ask that question. There's no way to find that answer because we wouldn't say we went ourselves to the to the movies. To is one of those transitive verbs that screws everything up, in my opinion. Okay, so another one that would be an intransitive verb would be he drove to the store. He drove what? Yeah, it could be his car. It could also be he drove himself. Okay. If you said he drove his mother, on the other hand, to the store, he drove what? Or should say whom? He drove his mother. Although that kind of makes it sound like he's like, yeah, yeah, he drove her like cattle, but I'm not sure that's what we were getting across there. Then his mother is receiving the action of being driven somewhere. We walked, or let's do she. or no, let's do the plural one. They walked to the park. They walked what? Themselves. However, this one is one of those multiple personality ones, because you could say they walked their dog. So they walked what? They walked their dog, or who, if you want to treat them like a person. So you can see here that there's some places where there's some wiggle room. But if you're using one of those prepositional phrases, those prepositions, then you're probably ending up with an adverbial noun and not a noun or a pronoun or a word group that you can use as a direct object. I hope that makes sense. We'll be practicing some more in the class. So just make sure that you're very careful about what you ran. If it's himself, herself, any of these selves, then you're likely to have a adverbial noun going on there. Okay, definitely want to test this one out, because I have a feeling that some of you are going to use a adverbial noun and it's not going to be working. Okay, so I hope that helps, and I'll see you guys in class.